Subscribe because it's free.
The Zalari Empire had ruled for thousands of years, a civilization so ancient that their own history blurred into myth. They stood at the pinnacle of technological and military power, a species so advanced that they no longer considered war a challenge, merely an exercise in dominance. Conquest was not a necessity but a sport, a ritual they performed with precision, watching lesser species kneel before them. Humans were no different in their eyes. A young race, barely a blip in the cosmic scale, too fragile to be a threat and too primitive to be of interest. The Zalari referred to them mockingly as apes, upright creatures that stumbled into space, playing at civilization. They found it amusing that humans dared to resist, as if an insect could stand against the tide. When the Zalari arrived in human-controlled space, they did not come with an offer of diplomacy. They came with fire. A single colony world stood in their path, one of many, an insignificant dot on a galactic map. It was not a strategic location, nor was it of great value, except for the fact that humans refused to surrender it. The demand was sent in the usual fashion: kneel, submit, integrate, or be erased. The Zalari had sent this ultimatum 1,000 times before, and every time the result was the same. Yet this time, the humans responded not with fear, but defiance. There would be no surrender. The destruction of the colony was swift. The Zalari did not even deploy ground forces. They did not need to. Orbital bombardment reduced the world to ash in less than a standard hour. The atmosphere burned, the oceans boiled, and the planet cracked beneath the intensity of their assault. There were no negotiations, no mercy, and no survivors. To the Zalari, it was routine. Another world fallen, another race put in its place. They returned to their empire, convinced that humanity had learned its lesson. They did not expect retaliation. After all, no species had ever struck back against the Zalari and survived. Supreme strategist Zelvaris, one of the Empire's most decorated military minds, dismissed any concerns about human resistance. The idea was laughable. The Zalari had crushed civilizations far greater than humanity. What could these short-lived creatures possibly do? They lacked the fleets, the firepower, the reach, but there was something unsettling in the silence that followed. No counterattack, no desperate plea for peace, no threats. Just nothing. The Zalari interpreted this as fear, a race too broken to even voice its submission, a quiet confirmation that they had been right all along. The apes had learned their place. They were wrong. The first sign that something was amiss came weeks later. A routine patrol along the human border failed to check in. A minor concern, pirates, malfunctions, a technical error. Then a second patrol vanished. A third. An entire fleet station at a forward base went dark without a single distress signal. Zelvaris ordered an investigation, assuming it was sabotaged by an internal faction. Perhaps rival empires had taken advantage of the situation, but the reality was far worse. A derelict Zalari warship drifted into one of their core systems, perfectly intact, its engines still running, its weapons powered down. It had not been damaged, nor had it suffered an external attack. The crew was simply gone. Not a single life form remained aboard. The ship's logs contained only one recorded transmission, repeated on an endless loop. "You should have left us alone." Zelvaris dismissed it as a fabrication, an elaborate hoax meant to instill fear. The Zalari did not fear. They conquered, they ruled, and they crushed rebellion before it could begin. And yet, the disappearances continued. Entire supply lines were disrupted. Zalari ships abandoned in deep space. Systems wiped clean, crews missing without a trace. Outposts fell silent one by one, as if swallowed by the void itself. The Zalari still refused to acknowledge what was happening. They were the dominant force in the galaxy. They had wiped out entire civilizations. They had burned worlds without consequence. There was no power capable of standing against them, until humanity gave them a reason to believe otherwise. The war had begun, but only one side realized it. The Zalari still believed they were in control, still convinced that humanity was incapable of true retaliation. They had crushed the colony, silenced resistance, and erased a world without consequence. In their minds, the matter was settled, but something was happening. Their fleets were being hunted, their outposts swallowed in silence. A war was raging in the darkness of space, and the Zalari were no longer the ones dictating the terms. Zelvaris ordered an emergency response. Dozens of scout fleets were dispatched to investigate the disappearing warships. Every vessel was equipped with the most advanced tracking systems, designed to detect even the most subtle anomalies. It didn't matter. They still vanished. There was no distress signal, no battle record. The ships simply ceased to exist. Even when Zalari Command sent fleets in overwhelming numbers, humanity did not engage them in direct combat. The humans refused to fight the way the Zalari expected. It started small. Supply convoys stopped arriving. Hyperspace lanes were disrupted. Communication networks were severed. Then it escalated. Entire shipyards were found abandoned. The workers missing. The stations eerily untouched. Weapons were stolen. Databases wiped clean. Entire research facilities hollowed out overnight. The Zalari scrambled to respond, but the pattern was unpredictable. Wherever they sent reinforcements, they arrived too late. Whatever defenses they reinforced, they were bypassed entirely. There was no logic to humanity's attacks, at least none that the Zalari could understand. And then came the message. A Zalari battleship, the Dominion's Wrath, was found drifting near the edge of their own empire. It was intact, undamaged, its engine still humming with energy. The only thing missing was its crew. The boarding party sent to investigate found no bodies, no traces of struggle, no sign of an attack. The ship had been abandoned, yet every system was still operational. The ship's log had been altered. There was only one file left, one final transmission recorded in eerie clarity. "We are coming." Zelvaris listened to it in silence. For the first time in his long career, he felt something unfamiliar, a sensation he had not known since his days as a young officer. Uncertainty. The Zalari did not lose. The Zalari did not retreat. And yet, he was beginning to realize that they had already lost control of the war. He demanded answers. His analysts and tacticians scrambled to provide explanations, but there was none. Humanity was deploying technology that should not have existed. They were striking with a precision the Zalari had never encountered. And worst of all, they were unpredictable. Zelvaris was accustomed to war fought on familiar terms. Superior firepower, overwhelming force, and decisive victories. But the humans were playing a different game. They did not engage in open battles. They did not attempt to conquer planets. They did not seek negotiations. They were dismantling the empire piece by piece. Some among the Zalari High Command began to worry. A quiet unease settled over their leadership. The empire had ruled unchallenged for millennia. Their fleets had reduced countless species to dust. But what was happening now was unlike anything they had faced before. The humans were not simply fighting back. They were waging a silent war, a war of shadows, of disruption, of precise, calculated destruction. And they were winning. The reports continued to flood in. A military base in the Galis sector went dark. A fleet station near the border simply ceased to exist. Factories producing Zalari war machines were found stripped of their foundations, their workers missing. But the most disturbing event came from a Zalari-controlled world, deep within the Empire's core. A planet untouched by war, fortified beyond measure, home to billions. One night, every screen, every holographic display, every communication device lit up at once. No matter where they were, no matter what they were doing, every Zalari saw the same message. "You should have left us alone." Then the lights went out. The power grid failed. The planetary defenses shut down, and for a full hour, the Zalari on that world experienced true darkness. When the systems finally returned, nothing seemed out of place, except for one thing. One of their largest military headquarters had been erased. Not destroyed, not bombed, simply gone. The building, the officers inside, the records it held, everything had been removed as if it had never existed. Zelvaris felt something creeping into his mind, something he had never allowed himself to acknowledge. Doubt. For the first time, he was beginning to understand. Humanity was not trying to win a war. They were not looking for an empire to conquer. They were delivering a message, and the Zalari were finally starting to hear it. The war had become something else. No longer a conquest, no longer a series of battles to be won or lost. It had transformed into something primal, a hunt, And for the first time in their empire's history, the Zalari were not the hunters. Zelvari sat in his war command center, watching as reports streamed in from across the empire. The situation had deteriorated beyond recognition. This was no longer just an insurgency. It was an extermination. Entire fleets had gone dark, not destroyed in glorious battle, not torn apart by planetary defenses, just gone. The Empire's supply chains were crippled. Their shipyards had abandoned, their workers having vanished without a trace. Even their core worlds, once thought untouchable, were no longer safe. Zelvaris had deployed the largest military mobilization in centuries, yet it made no difference. Humanity refused to fight in the way the Zalari had prepared for. They did not meet the Empire on the battlefield. They did not engage in prolonged warfare. They simply struck, disappeared, and struck again. It was worse than war. It was fear, creeping into the very foundation of the Empire. And then the final blow came. It started with a single human fleet appearing at the edge of Zalari Prime, the capital of the Empire, the heart of its civilization. For the first time since the war began, humanity had arrived in force. Zalari warships scrambled to respond, mobilizing every available vessel to defend their homeworld. Their fleets, though diminished, were still the largest in the galaxy. They still held numerical superiority, and their defenses were unmatched. But numbers did not matter. Defenses did not matter. Not against what the humans had brought with them. The Zalari fleet formed their battle lines, waiting for the humans to advance. But they didn't. Instead, the human fleet remained eerily still, silent. No communication, no demands, no warnings. Then the lights went out. Every Zalari warship, every orbital defense platform, every planetary shield generator, all of it shut down at once. Their most advanced technology, their impenetrable security systems, all rendered useless in an instant. The humans had not come to fight. They had come to dismantle. Panic spread through the Empire's forces as their ships drifted, helpless. High-ranking officers screamed into dead communication channels, demanding answers that would never come. Then, one by one, their warships began to die. Not in fiery explosions, not in grand battles. They simply stopped functioning. Weapons failed, engines shut down, life support systems flickered and faded. The once mighty Zalari fleet was reduced to floating wreckage, not by force, but by precision, by control. On the surface of Zalari Prime, the ruling council gathered in desperation, seeking guidance from the one who had led them through every war. But Zelvaris had no answers. He had underestimated them. He had dismissed them. He had mocked them as nothing more than primitive apes playing at war. And now, standing at the heart of his dying empire, he realized the truth too late. Humanity had never been fighting for survival. They had been delivering a reckoning. Zelvaris watched as the final reports came in. Entire sectors were falling into chaos. The Empire's borders had collapsed. What had once been a dominion spanning hundreds of systems was now nothing more than scattered, isolated pockets of resistance, cut off from one another, waiting for the inevitable. It was over, but the humans were not finished, because they had not come to merely defeat the Zalari. They had come to erase them. Zelvaris stood in silence, gazing out over the burning skyline of Zalari Prime. The once great capital, a world that had never known war, was dying, not in a single cataclysmic event, but in something far worse, systematic dismantling. The human fleet still hung in orbit, unmoving. They had yet to fire a single conventional shot. They didn't need to. The Zalari's own technology had become useless. The Empire's defenses had been stripped away without a fight. This was not war. This was extermination. And yet, humanity still had not made their final move. Zelvaris turned to his advisors, the last remnants of the Zalari High Command. They were once the most powerful individuals in the Empire, leaders who had dictated the fate of entire species. Now, they were nothing more than frightened creatures, their eyes filled with the realization that the enemy they had mocked was not an enemy at all. They were executioners. The main display in the war chamber flickered to life. It was not a Zalari transmission. It was human. A single message appeared on the screen, written in the Zalari's own language. "You called us apes. Zelvares felt his throat tighten. He could almost hear the laughter of his people, the mockery, the arrogance. How many times had they dismissed humanity as nothing more than primitive animals? How many times had he repeated that sentiment himself? The screen changed. Another message. We unmade your fleets. His mind flashed to the countless reports of vanished ships, missing colonies, abandoned stations. They had tried to understand the pattern. They had failed. Humanity had been toying with them the entire time. Another message. We unmade your empire. He knew it was true. The empire was gone. Its core worlds, its armies, its power scattered like dust. The final message appeared. Now we will unmake your son. Zelvares' blood ran cold. He turned sharply to his advisors, but they were already moving, scrambling, screaming into dead communication links. No response. No orders to give. There was nothing left to command. A tremor passed through the world. The sky darkened, not from smoke or cloud cover, but from something else, something far worse. The human fleet had finally begun its final act. Orbital telescopes captured the impossible. A structure, massive beyond comprehension, appeared near the Zalari sun. It had not warped in, nor had it been detected on approach. It had simply been there, hidden beyond the limits of Zalari understanding. It was not a weapon in the traditional sense. It did not fire projectiles. It did not deploy energy bursts. It did something far more terrifying. It reached into the heart of the Zalari sun and began to unmake it. Within moments, readings spiraled into chaos. The sun's fusion process destabilized. The delicate balance that had sustained it for billions of years unraveled. Zelvares watched in horror as the impossible happened. The star, the very source of life for his people, began to collapse. Not in an explosion, not in a supernova. It simply faded. The Zalari sun, once a brilliant beacon in the galaxy, was being erased from existence. Zelvares fell back, gripping the edges of the war table as realization consumed him. Humanity had not just destroyed the Zalari. They had undone them. They had wiped away their fleets, their colonies, their infrastructure. And now, in their final act, they were erasing the very star that had given them life. The temperature on Zalari Prime began to drop. The once vibrant skies turned a deep shade of black. Cities fell silent. The world, for all its greatness, was dying. And there was nothing the Zalari could do. No negotiations. No surrender. Humanity had given them a choice long ago. They had ignored it. Now they were paying the price. As the last remnants of warmth faded from the planet, Zelvares did not scream. He did not rage. He simply sat in silence, watching the death of his people. And in his final moments, he understood the truth. The Zalari had ruled through fear. They had thought themselves untouchable. But in the end, they had been nothing more than prey. And the apes they had mocked had become something far worse than conquerors. They had become the reapers of empires.